This is NHTV2, North Haven Government Television, a service of North Haven Community Television.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the North Haven Library. I'd like to introduce professor and TV personality Kenn Venit. He's been a great source to our community, and I'm so intrigued to be able to hear what he has to tell us about real and fake news. So, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, North Haven. It is nice to be here. I live in Hamden, have lived there 47 years. And not a month goes by that my wife doesn't ask, when are we moving to North Haven? So I'm 74, she's a little younger. And at some point when it's time for us to give up our raised ranch, I know that she's probably going to look in North Haven first. And it's a marvelous town. I've watched it all these years. And as some of you may know, I've moderated the candidates' debates, co-hosted the Memorial Day weekend parades, and the election night live coverage. So I've seen it firsthand. It is a fantastic town, and I just admire so much what you have and what you do. And it's just it's a miracle that a place like this can exist in America these days. Everybody gets along, the Republicans, the Democrats, and the independents. It's just amazing to watch. I teach courses over the years at Southern and Quinnipiac that involve the First Amendment and the idea of how we use free speech and why there's a press and why it has theoretically some protection, although it actually has no more authority to do anything than anyone in this room. The First Amendment was created to tell Congress what it can't do. If you read it, it's a list of things. Congress shall make no law, blah, blah, that, among other things, restricts the press. The initial concept for the press was we would have the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, and the so-called fourth estate would be the press. The press was contentious back then, as it is now. As a matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson was the first president to sue a newspaper for libel, and it was the Hartford Courant, and he lost. But Jefferson is also noted for having said, or he was asked, in effect, it's the question that he's answering, if you had a choice between a government or a free press, which would you choose? And he said a free press. Things have changed a little bit. The contentiousness that we have today with our current president, who says the press is the enemy. Basically, that leads into what is fake news. And one of the definitions these days, because it's frankly a very new phrase in how it's being used, and one pundit said, fake news is whatever the president says it is when he doesn't like what somebody has said about him. And that's where it started. He's actually, in many circles, getting credit for taking the words fake and news, putting them out there, and again, there's no formal definition of it, but that's one of them. My definition of fake news is a little bit different, and I'll touch a bit on the concept of ethics in journalism, which some people say is somewhat oxymoronic. It's not. But I look at what we call fake news often as intentional misleading of the public, intentional. However, some things are fake because they weren't done ethically. They didn't follow procedures that journalism has had for many years, especially broadcast journalism, because we're seeing a lot of the news these days. So in reflecting on how did we get to where we are and what is the responsibility of the press, we go back to colonial times. And colonial times, the press was to look at the other three branches of government. The press may have seen itself also as a branch of government, but they're not. That means that when we have freedom of the press, everyone is entitled to freedom of the press. I'm a member of the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm also in the Connecticut Professional Journalists Hall of Fame. I'm a professional journalist, and no one, including the organization that I've belonged to for so many years, okay, what's a professional journalist? someone who maybe shot some video and sent it to a TV station, someone who got paid $1 for a still picture that went into a local newspaper, and professional. You know, we're not up there with doctors and lawyers and people who have to have degrees. Journalists don't, and advanced degrees in many cases. We don't. So how do we define professional journalists? Well, we think professional is an attitude. It's an MO, a modus operandus. It is the way you operate. And I'm going to give you an example of how picky we were, for example, at Channel 8 Action News in the 70s. When I worked there, I had every job in the building, on and off the air as far as news went. But one night, I was producing the 6 o'clock news, an hour-long newscast. And that day, late in the afternoon, we had received a phone call from someone that is referred to as a stringer. This is someone who gets paid for giving us tips, and sometimes giving us, in those days, film. And he was very reliable. He was virtually never wrong. But he called us one afternoon, and he said, when the call came into the newsroom, he said, "I want to talk to Venit." And I was pretty busy, but when they told me who it was, I said, "I'll take the call." And he's well known, or was, he's passed away, John Mangello Jr. He was this stringer, and he had connections with the police departments, local and state. And again, it was, usually you could just say, if it came from John, we could use it, but we didn't. We had to verify it. So that day he says, you know, he didn't quite call it the alleged underworld person who's been missing. He referred to someone as a mobster. And of course, you got to prove it's a mobster. Underworld, I'm not sure. But anyway, he said, they found the body floating off of New York City this morning. And I said, who found the body? He said, the police found the body. Which police? All I can tell you is police found the body. Now, he says, I can't confirm that. My sources say the body has been found in New York City. Well, one of our 800-pound gorillas in there, who had some authority and some influence, said, oh, wow, that's going to be the lead story. And I said, no, we have to confirm it. I have the word of a stringer who's reliable, but he can't tell me anything. His sources are his sources, not our sources. If we run that story, it's on us. So I called Channel 7 New York. They had an assignment editor who had worked at Channel 8. And he took the call, and I said, Noah, first of all, how you doing? Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And he's going, why are you calling me? I said, because we have a story here that they found a body today of an underworld character who's been missing from New Haven for a long time, and it's him. And he said, well, first of all, what's the name? I gave him the name. He said, I'll check it out. He called me back about 5 minutes later, laughing. I said, why are you laughing? I said, well, you asked me if they fished anybody out of the water today. Well, they fish people out every day. But it just happens today, nobody got fished out. And it definitely wasn't the name you mentioned, because nobody got fished out. So end of story. So I told the person who was pressing hard, we're not running it. But John's always been reliable. I said, John is reliable for John. He doesn't represent Channel 8. And until we can get 2 confirmed sources, the preference was for 2. Occasionally we would take 1 depending on how high up the ladder that one was. I said, we're not running it. 6 o'clock comes, and it's not in our newscast. But another station in this state led with it, just as our guy said we should have. And he called me during the show. I was in the control room, and during a commercial, he says, you know, Channel X ran it. I said, well, I don't care if Channel X ran it. So at 6:30, when the news was over, you know, it's why aren't we running it? And he still wasn't buying it. We haven't confirmed it. And I said, not only that, we're not even looking for anything now. I'm told the story's already flawed. So I went home. This person worked nights. And at 11 o'clock, the story wasn't in the newscast. Another producer made that decision. And the other channel ran a correction. Actually, it was sort of a correction. I wish it could be called an apology. But the journalists don't generally apologize. They'll run a correction. That's it. That's as far as they'll go. Because they had run a 6 o'clock story that was wrong. We didn't have anything in our show because we didn't run anything that was wrong. That kind of meticulousness was the kind of meticulousness and ethics that we used. Another story that comes to mind about don't rush what you have. The Ku Klux Klan was having a rally in eastern Connecticut. It was in a time when the Klan was active in Connecticut, and it turned out that a scoutmaster in the Naugatuck Valley was also a Klan Grand Wizard. And he resigned, but there were protests in the street and all that. But we got a call at Channel 8 saying, we're going to run a rally tonight. We're going to burn a cross on private property, and you're invited to cover it. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, really. But you can only send a white reporter and a white photographer. I said, well, you're not going to tell me who I'm going to send or whether I'm going to send. So I called a newsroom meeting, and at the time there were 3 African Americans on our staff. 2 were actually Yale students, presidential scholars. They both worked as reporters. And the 3rd was a professional photographer. And I told them what happened, and I said, I'm not going to assign anybody on the basis of what color you are, that's for sure. But do I have any volunteers who want to go cover the Klan? And the 2 Yale students, those hands went up before my sentence was ended, and the African-American photographer was up there too. So the 2 fellas decided between them who would go. So we sent them out there. It was far eastern Connecticut, like maybe now where the casinos are now. We used to have some training camps out there for terrorist organizations. Posse Comitas did that. So Klan activity wasn't a shock. Well, the guys get there, and the Klan sees what we sent, and they had already figured out what to say, and the answer was, if you don't like us, you won't be on Channel 8 tonight. So they let them in because they wanted to be on television. They came back to New Haven, and this is the day of film. It takes 1 hour to process the first frame. I said, don't rush, because we're not going to put it on the air tonight. And they're going like, what are you talking about? I said, we're going to watch it in private, and I'm going to hold it till tomorrow. I want the management to look at this, and we're going to make a group decision on what to do. We're not going to break our necks to get into the 11 o'clock news. It's just not going to happen. So the next day, we put the footage up on the projector, and there was about 12 people involved, including the management, because we had never shown the Klan like this. And we decided we weren't going to run a full package. That's where a reporter does, stand-ups and interviews and all of that. We decided we're going to give it 20 seconds. It's called a voiceover, 20-second voiceover. You saw the cross, you saw the fire, you saw the hooded guys, and we just said they were there. The police were there I think the police were there to protect them. At least they thought they needed protection. Nobody showed up other than the press. And at that night, we ran 20 seconds of it, and everybody was satisfied with that. We were not going to be used. Our point in running it at all was simply, you've got to know this is going on. You can't just say it happens only in the South or somewhere else. 20 seconds was all it took to tell that story. We didn't have to tell any more. The idea that we held that video today, aside from the fact it would have been on the internet before we ever saw it, but it would be a tough call for somebody to say we're not using it. Now, it was interesting, you've probably been noticing the video out of New Zealand, where they have captured the suspect, and his head is blurred in a circle. That is the law in New Zealand. And I don't know how far it goes, whether it's just for murder or other crimes. I think it's an interesting law, but here, if you did that, if a law agency was doing that, unless they had a really good reason, they'd be claiming, the media would say, you're denying our First Amendment right, freedom of information, we have a right to know what somebody looks like. They're also, in many cases today, not giving the name there. Here the name is out, and if you want to see a picture of his face, you can find it. The immediacy of making mistakes is that they're often made without thought, without filters. Back in the day, we had filters. A producer or somebody else of authority had to read a script before it would go on the air. Today, when you're live, they try to put a script in, but sometimes it's going to be ad lib. But you have to know sort of what points are going to be covered. And a good reporter today has to be able to think on his or her feet, because they may be doing multiple live shots, multiple studio hits, they call it. It's same story, different versions, but you have to be careful about what you say. And again, you don't want to say more than ethically should be said. I consulted the Weather Channel for 10 years when my second career was in consulting. And one of the great things about the Weather Channel, they had a motto, internal, it wasn't on TV. We will never tell you more than we know. And in the newsroom, you can't tell me something you don't know. The rule was, though, if after the report, you wanted to say to the reporter, well, in your opinion, okay, reporters don't have a crystal ball in front of them, so that opinion to me was often just conjecture, which is what you hear today. My sources tell me. Well, we used to say unidentified sources within the administration or something like that. Now it's my sources. That's like saying Mangello. My sources tell me. Well, my sources aren't good enough, even if it's somebody working for me. Our rules back then were you have to tell someone in management who your source is. And they would agree not to reveal it, but we needed to take the responsibility for what your source is telling us, because it's the rest of the news organization. And today, you trust these people. The one that drives me nuts is, what is your sense of what is going to happen? I mean, Dr. Phil had a mentalist on his show. And I don't know, if reporters are disguising themselves as mentalists, then maybe they might hit an answer once in a while that's correct, but I don't think so. What is your sense? How many days have we been told the Mueller report is due? Any minute now. It's like having a baby that goes past the due date, by a month, and that sort of thing. So procedure made the difference between mistakes going on the air and fake news. Another story that I have been analyzing in my classes is this incident that happened in Washington, where you saw, in the initial video, a bunch of Catholic school men wearing MAGA hats, red hats, and they were there to protest. They were pro-life. They were there for a protest for that. What you saw in somebody just shooting a few seconds was that young fella, Sandman is his last name, he's suing CNN for CNN is $275 million. The Washington Post is $250 million. His family saying they have, the guy got death threats. But what you saw, some of the press, so they're writing off a video. There were no reporters there. It was something that people got by a cell phone and then start putting it on media, social media, and then the press picks it up and runs with it and writes their own narration. And a number of them referred to smirking. Well, I froze that video in my classes on a big screen, and I said, I'm not taking that as a smirk because of the length. And the Native American, whose name was Phillips, originally identified as a Vietnam vet. He was a veteran, but not Vietnam. It may have been Vietnam era, but they were misidentifying him. And they're like, a few inches apart. And the guy is beating a tom-tom, and the kid is smiling. So when you say he's smirking, then it can translate, appear to be disrespectful. And other people said, look, he's disrespectful. The Archdiocese of Kentucky said they were being disrespectful. All these Hollywood stars were saying the boy was being disrespectful, and the others were laughing. It was an unusual situation. He was just smiling. And then there was a group called the Black Hebrew Israelites, which I'd never heard of, but one of the leaders was from New York. And they were there, had their own protest going on. So you have three protests going on, basically. The Native American, who was pretty much by himself, there may have been a couple other people, but he stepped up to that boy. They were having a protest against abortion, and the Black Hebrew Israelites were having a protest that had something to do with Israel, Palestine, and whatever is going on. But what we didn't see in that initial version was that the protests were a 2-hour event. And some documentarians had what happened before that video that you saw. And what happened before is that the Israelites tried to goad the boys into a confrontation. And Sandman told the kids, just be cool. They did not respond to the goading, which went on for quite a long time. The Native American walked up to the boys and never said anything. He just walked up to them, and then the other group is, continuing to try to provoke them, and the boys would not be provoked. They stood their ground. They were there for something else. And they were more mature than a lot of adults would have been, I think. You also have a more current situation, the incident in East Haven, where a mother used the N-word, and there was some kind of a confrontation. But you only see one cell phone piece of video. And that has gone on, and it turns out that a number of people, police have talked to a lot of people who were there, and there was something going on before that video you saw. And apparently what was going on was a provocation. Now, you can't justify the N-word under any circumstances, but something had happened that we didn't see. And this happens time and time again, but you've already seen the video, and it was not done by someone who was a reporter verifying any information. So, again, to me, that's fake news. It may be real news to some people, but it's not news to me until it's validated, and you're following the rules and you're doing them. In the business, we have an expression. If you have to choose between first and being accurate, choose accurate. If you can be first and accurate, that's good stuff. But you have to remember, until you have your own sources verifying. I see now even BuzzFeed BuzzFeed put something out and all the media are quoting BuzzFeed. I'm sorry, I don't even know who owns it or what. But anybody who puts out a story these days gets quoted, and the source is somebody who hasn't necessarily vetted the story. And again, I wouldn't use something like that. But if the Washington Post writes it or the New York Times writes it, no matter what gets said behind closed doors in Congress, people will quote them forever. Gabby Gifford, the congresswoman who was shot in the head out in Arizona, initial reports that were carried by Fox News Radio and then carried by everybody else within minutes said she was dead. Fox had interviewed a woman who witnessed the shooting. She said, I saw what happened. She has to be dead. Well, she wasn't dead. But Fox reported, said she was dead. And then other people reported. And then they ran the correction. Fox itself should have been the only people who made that mistake. But when you're telling me your organization, ABC, CBS, NBC, any like that, I want you, because I've chosen you, I want you to validate the information. I shouldn't have to go to, try to call up a police department and go, is she dead? Sometimes, and I'll show you where restraint is incredible. When President Kennedy was shot, you saw the parade, and later you saw the Zapruder film where exactly when he was shot. You also saw that that was about 12:30 their time. It was reported that he died at 1 o'clock. That's not true. He was dead at 12:30. The car speeded up. They went to Parkland, and press was outside, and there were people who went in and out, members of Congress, priests that came in and out. They're working on him. They're trying everything they can. Well, when that shot went through his head and blew his brains out and most of his skull, the car ahead had a reporter who saw one of the Secret Service guys that he knew behind the car, and the reporter went, like, what happened? And the Secret Service agent went, the reporter did not report that. Everybody who witnessed where that car was knew that his brain was no longer in his head. Jackie said, they've killed him. She knew he was dead. So the question becomes, and it wasn't until 50 years later that that story about this and that came out, but why would they not tell us he was dead for 30 minutes? There were a lot of good reasons. Didn't know who did it. Didn't know if the number 2 guy, Lyndon Johnson, was involved. Needed some time to figure out what we're going to do next. And that took almost half an hour. But the press knew, and when you watch the footage, no one gave any clue from 12:30 on that the president was dead, although they knew it. During World War II, loose lips sink ships. There were battles between the Nazi submarines and American and other nationality merchant marine type ships from Maine to the west coast of Florida and on the west coast of California. You were told what you see, do not talk about. And the next day the government came around. I did an article on it for a publication called the Justice Journal that I was editor of a couple years back. I had a hard time finding anything in any newspaper about the supposedly 600 ships that were sunk from Maine to the west coast of Florida, and the estimated 3,000 people who may have died as a result. If you go to New London and you happen to be a scuba diver, a few miles out of the harbor is a Nazi submarine. You're not allowed to touch it. That's a federal offense because the bodies are still in there. And there's another one off of Block Island. Nobody knew about that. It wasn't in the papers. So we have a press that knows how to be responsible, even though at times they know something that they're holding back, and they had their reasons. Today, I don't know if there's anything that the press would hold back because they would say something like, it's already on the internet. By the time a decision is made, even if it took a minute, somebody's posted it. And that shooting in New Zealand was posted live. He plugged in, he had his GoPro camera, and he had his audio set up, and everything that he did was posted immediately, and other people started sending it out. Facebook and the other media took it down as quickly as they could, and according to the Wall Street Journal, you can't take it down anymore because it gets out so fast, and there's so many sites that keep duplicating it. I don't know where the dark net is, but it's got a lot of stuff out there. But this kind of an event not only happens live, you can't bury it. It's going to continue, and it could wind up being a recruiting video for ISIS, like, you don't need an army to be a terrorist. This guy took out 50. So we have so many things happening, and again, in my courses, I relate them to current events, and we go back, and then you start the discussion. Is the press doing its job? And when we say the press, I think it's unfortunate that we lump the national media with the local media. The local media, by and far, are doing a very good job. They play by the rules. Sometimes because they don't want to get sued. The corporate people who own them are a little bit tight. They don't want to pay lawyers if it can be avoided. But the bottom line is you get very good news coverage here, and very rarely is there something that shouldn't have been on. The whole Sandy Hook shooting was done with tremendous restraint. But there was a mistake early on. We were told it was a Quinnipiac student at one point. And I get a call at home, 3 o'clock that Friday. Professor Venit, you don't know me, but I'm a Quinnipiac alum. Yeah, why are you calling me? Somebody told me that you might be able to help identify this student who was the shooter. I had no idea what he was talking about. I referred him to the Public Relations Department, Public Affairs Office. And there were reports that went out that it was a Quinnipiac student because the young man had stolen his brother's ID, and his brother had gone to Quinnipiac. The information apparently came through an FBI source to an NBC reporter who was so proud of his sources. He had an exclusive. That reporter's still on the job. By the time people found out it was mistaken identity, they were kind of not apologizing, just correcting. It wasn't a Quinnipiac student. And then, because all kinds of things happened within a couple of hours. But there was another example of a theoretically intelligent and experienced reporter trusting his source to the point of risking a career. Another situation that was horrible was a guy named Richard Jewell. The Olympics that were in Atlanta. A bomb went off. Jewell had called in, he was a security guard who wanted to become a cop. He was kind of a rumpled guy. And at first they said, well, you're a hero. You got everybody out. People started, well, wait a minute. How did he happen to be just there? Number one, he was assigned to be there. Why? Because he was at a phone bank in those days. We didn't all have cell phones. And he was watching this, and when he saw a backpack, and he called it in. And, it was real. After a couple of days where he was a media hero, NBC put him on the Today Show, for example, and it came out that he lived with his mother. And the media he's a bachelor. He wants to be a cop, but he's only a security guard. And he lives with his mother. They couldn't get over that. 32 years old or something like that. The end of the story is he was a hero. He prevented people from getting killed. Various media were sued. There's always a lawyer who can look at this and say, whoa. And no one knows if he got any money, but CNN and others were sued. And one of the things that I know that he died a couple years ago. I think it was a heart problem. But one of the things was all he wanted was an apology. He had been destroyed. I mean, for years we were using that whole case as a case study of what not to do. And it's the kind of thing now, I see it more frequently. Somebody is so sure of their source that they will bet their career on it and the reputation of the person that's getting smeared. I don't know how many of you cheered when it turns out Stormy Daniels' case was thrown out against Donald Trump recently. It didn't seem to get much traction in the news, but you certainly saw all the stories when things were, going in a different direction. But I don't know who tells the truth anymore, and lie detectors aren't accurate enough. But a couple of journalists who vet their stories the way they're supposed to, I can trust them. And in a court where you might get sued, one of your defenses is truth. If the other side says you're lying, they have to prove that it's not true. And if this side can prove it's true, you win. It's a very simple process, not necessarily easy, but that's what the rules are. If you told the truth, you're okay. If you didn't tell the truth, you're not okay. So we see a lot more of that. And going back to Jefferson suing the Hartford Courant, the nation's oldest continuous publication. It's not like they get a plaque up there. We were sued by a president of the United States and he lost. But that also set a precedent for public officials because they didn't want public officials to be able, in effect, to threaten the media. I'm going to sue you. Well, anyone in this room can sue the president, but the president can't sue you. He can try, and the courts are going to throw it out. One final note before Q&A, and this one's a little risque. Risque and a little tough to take. When I ask my students, is hate speech protected? They say no. It is protected. A hate crime is different. You're beating somebody over the head, calling them you dumb jerk, but then you call them you dumb something else, and they get hurt or die. That's a hate crime. You are allowed to burn the American flag. In the 60s, a lot of them got burned. But some years back in New Haven, somebody saw an American flag on the front lawn of a house near the campus. And he torched it. And he got arrested by the New Haven police. He wasn't arrested for burning an American flag. He was arrested for destruction of private property and the violation of fire codes. You can't even burn your leaves on your front lawn in many places. And he burned that flag right there on the front lawn. There are so many cases out there where there ought to be a law. And somebody says, you shouldn't be able to burn a flag. Many people think a football player should not take a knee when they're playing the Star-Spangled Banner. I did a look into it, and then I gave students some, tell me why you shouldn't, if you think we shouldn't have it. If you read the lyrics around the third stanza, there's a whole history lesson in there, because the ship that Francis Scott Key was on was a British ship. There were American POWs down below, and he was there to negotiate the release of a doctor who they didn't want the British to throw him in jail because the guy really treated wounded soldiers, including British. And the war was coming to an end, but they wouldn't let this Francis Scott Key leave their boat because they knew it was coming to an end, and he also knew the plans for the final battle. Meanwhile, the flag that on our side, the flag is up there all night long, and he writes the song about it. But if you read those lyrics, he was bragging that we had beaten the British force, which included a ship, and they had something on board called the Colonial Militia. And they were all black. Some were free men, some were slaves who ran away. The British promised them freedom and all kinds of things if they won. And he was actually bragging in these later stanza about that. As for taking a knee, originally Colin Kaepernick was sitting on the bench. And another NFL retiree came along and contacted him and said, that's disrespectful. But he said to Colin, what is respectful is taking a knee. And if I had two legs that worked good, I would show you. But what's that famous picture of George Washington at Valley Forge? He's taking a knee. What's he doing? He's praying. And it can be a sign of respect. I don't know if that's what Colin had in mind, but he stopped just sitting on a bench and he went to taking the knee after the NFL player suggested do this instead of that. So there's what Paul Harvey used to call the rest of the story. Remember, he made you wait 5 seconds? And that's the rest of the story. I mean, that 5 seconds felt like a minute to me. But that's the thing. Sometimes we don't get the rest of the story until centuries later, decades later, and sometimes never. Now, I could go on, and my classes go 2.5 hours without a break. They'd just leave the room when it's time to leave the room. But I said, I got momentum. You know, don't stop me. It's amazing how many of them in the midterms mentioned going through the entire 2.5 hours without leaving a room because they were afraid they might miss something. Well, I'd rather they leave the room than, cause the facilities people to leave me nasty notes overnight. But I'm, at this point, very willing and happy and eager to take questions from you or comments. We have a microphone if you don't think you can project loud enough. Is there someone who would volunteer to come first? Sir.
Talk about the news. When you were doing the news, there was Channel 8, there was Channel 3, maybe Channel 5. Now there's 100 stations. When you talked about local news, you were really a local station. You were owned by, back in time, do you remember who you were?
Triangle, originally, then
now,
Cap Cities.
Who are they owned by now?
Nexstar.
Which probably owns 100 stations,
Well,
100 markets.
160, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think that's doing? I was never a big fan.
Okay. What you're referring to is once upon a time we had local ownership. Or Channel 8 was originally locally owned. They sold to Triangle, which was headed by Walter Annenberg in Philadelphia. He owned 7 stations, I think it was. And they were all locally managed very carefully. And then bigger and bigger companies started buying. The FCC changed the rules, so you were no longer limited to 7. And the organization chart, based on the Communications Act of 1928, had like the public at the top. And then you had the ownership and this and that. Now, the shareholders are at the top. And I'm not saying that you can't be a good conglomerate and run a good program, but there's a different kind of a priority right now. When I came to Connecticut in '69, I worked at Channel 3, WTIC AM FM, owned by the Travelers. And they treated that station as their own private radio station and TV station. And they didn't want anything on the air that was inappropriate. In 1969, there was the so-called Labor Day riot in Hartford, only we didn't call it that. We were equipped with Motorola two-way radios, helmets, gas masks, and brown shirts with epaulets so we can string the Motorola's over it. And everything we said was fed into the station, to a tape recorder. And within 5 minutes, someone in management listened to your report and then authorized it to be played back or not. We were also warned, do not use the word riot. If you call it a riot, people will come down to see it or join it. It was a civil disorder, which again is oxymoronic. How do you have a civil disorder? But and a fellow at the Quinnipiac's working on a PhD dissertation, and part of it is going to be based on local ownership versus the conglomerate. A good conglomerate wants to serve the community. So when it's license renewal time or you're an advertiser, you'll be there for them. But again, you've got to have procedures. Now, those procedures that were in effect at WTIC were extraordinary. And that was a very big company. They weren't worried about lawsuits or the FCC or anybody else. They could do whatever they wanted. They wanted us to just do it right. And they figured out how to make sure we were doing it right. By the way, during that thing, I was with a police car in a circle at an intersection. And there were people screaming from a tenement house in Spanish, and no one could speak Spanish. But the people around us started throwing rocks. And I'm doing a little narration. There's a woman doing this, blah, blah. The firehouse is here, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, I got hit in the back of the neck. And I went, oops, I just been hit by a rock. And I stopped at that point. TIC listened to it and played it back. My wife heard it at home. Our 2 babies. Well, I don't know if they were listening. They were pretty small at the time. She calls the station and said, is he all right? Oh, yeah, that was a tape. And she's trying to understand that if you're hit by a tape, you must be all right. No, I was hit by a rock. They recorded it and played the tape. I wasn't a happy camper. But again, that goes to the absolute nth degree of respecting the community and making sure that we get it right. Anyone else? Please.
You mentioned that during World War II, there were a number of ships that were sunk by German
Yep.
U-boats on the West Coast
Yep.
and the East Coast, and that the media didn't report it.
Right.
Do you think that was good?
If you were alive during that war on the beaches of Connecticut or Long Island, I don't think you had a problem with, you knew what was going on, but you also knew, think of the panic, the absolute panic we would have had. A German submarine commander, his sub came out of the water outside New York Harbor, and he went up on deck because it was night. Nobody was going to see anything. If you lit a cigarette, you'd see it from up there. But he recorded in his log using his Zeiss binoculars. He could see the fleet, but they weren't his target. He made a right turn to go up Long Island Sound. But imagine what that story would have done. I was with my grandfather when I was about 10 years old off Atlantic City. He got a home there. And I just asked him one day, because we always went what's called wreck fishing. And I said, what's the wreck? And he said, Nazi submarines from the war. And this is in the 1950s, so the war wasn't that far back. I was born in 45. But he said they sank a lot of ships, and the fish like to turn those into cities, and that the sonar thing on our ships, on our fishing boats that we used to go out on, charter boats, had these graphs, and you could see the fish, schools of fish going, and that's why we did the wreck fishing. But that's when I learned, I said, we're so close to Atlantic City. He said, yeah, we're about 20 miles. And it just sank in. 20 miles away, the submarines were sinking our ships.
That's like saying that news that people don't want to hear shouldn't be reported.
No, I don't agree with that. And there were a couple of stations. One of them was in Minneapolis, and they had a different consulting company than the one I worked for. And at 5 o'clock, they had the good news. A whole half hour of good news. And the people said, if there's a serial rapist going around town, I don't want to wait until 6 o'clock to find out. And their ratings tanked. And their consultants didn't apologize. They just corrected it, went back to if it bleeds, it leads. That was the principle back then. Was there a question in the back? Yeah.
We were talking about truth and being sued or not being sued. In the case of that man, Jewel, from the South, they said it was strange that he lived with his mother at
Yeah.
32. They were doing it, they were casting aspersions.
Oh, they did more than that. They were analyzing, for example, there was a live shot on NBC, because they did it, and they were talking to their reporter, who also is the one, I think, who got Sandy Hook wrong. And he had run down all that the police were doing. And he said, the fact that they reopened the Olympics, and this, that, and the other thing, they only have one suspect, and we all know who that is. Really? But that's the similar to what was said and implied, inferred. You can call it what you want, but collectively, they made us know. They had shots of this guy coming in and out of his house and everywhere he went, and they were making fun of him. And he was too easy a mark.
But making fun is not fair.
Well, when you make fun to the degree that this guy is singled out, for terrorism, and he has still never received an award for the heroism. He's dead. You could still do it posthumously. It's never been done. Nobody, it wouldn't come from the media, but nobody has done that. You could always rectify that shortcoming, but no one has. Another question? Comment? Go ahead. Yes. If I said ladies first, is that okay?
It's okay.
Okay.
So you had mentioned, you opened your talk with the saying that our president calls news that he doesn't agree with fake news.
Right.
So now that there's so many news choices on there, you have Fox agreeing with the president. You have
Not
MSNBC.
always. You watch 3 o'clock, Shepard Smith.
Okay.
You think you got the wrong channel.
Really? Okay, maybe they're becoming, what's their tagline? Fair and balanced?
No, they dropped that years ago.
Oh, they did drop
Yes, they did.
So you have MSNBC on the other side. So those are more opinions rather than,
Yes.
say, like Walter Cronkite news.
Walter Cronkite and people back in those days, at the end of a newscast usually, you saw the word commentary or analysis. They label. It's called labeling. We labeled. We had editorials. Today, they don't do it that way. It's blended in. A reporter suddenly is saying, so we fully expect Mueller. We fully expect who? We'll be releasing that report any day now because these people are looking for jobs out of Washington, and they give you all the reasons. It was kind of like Comey, who gave you all the reasons to indict Hillary and said, but nobody in their right mind would do that. Well, but now they're telling me because some of his people are looking for other jobs, well, maybe they completed the part of the mission that they were assigned to. And they're not, even though they make good money, apparently they could be making a lot more money in private practice and investigations. And they just stayed long enough, I think, to fulfill. But that's what I think. I'm not putting it out there like, this is why he's going to release it. There was one back there, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I remember it really accurately because I was like 9 years old at the time, but going back to where you talked about like with Gabby Giffords, and the people jumping and saying, oh, she has to be dead. I remember when Reagan was shot.
Yep.
And James Brady was hit. I remember pretty clearly, but again, I could be wrong. Basically, he had a bullet wound right through his forehead, and I remember the news people just kept saying, James Brady's dead, James Brady's dead.
Well, what happened was, actually, they were talking about President Reagan when he got shot. ABC had Frank Reynolds on the air, and Channel 8, we were all looking up at the monitor, and he goes like this, listening in there. I've just been told President Reagan has died of his wounds. Then, in about 3 seconds, he went, now I'm told he has not died from his wounds. And right in front of national TV, you couldn't see who he's talking to. He said, let's get this straight. From now on, we don't report anything unless we confirm it 2 ways. And we're all going like, wow, he just trued out the staff. And I don't know whatever happened to whoever got it wrong, but all I know is when we heard, and we go like this, and then we go, what? It was miraculous. He came back to life. He never died. Same thing with Gabby Gifford. Yes?
So you live in Hamden, so do I, and we're dealing with Hearst in the newspaper. I don't know which newspaper you live in.
I get the Register and the New York Post, and I used to get, and the Wall Street Journal. I used to get the Hartford Courant, but I just gave it up.
We used to have weekly newspapers,
Right?
and it sort of
Like
like dwindled down.
Hamden
to-
Chronicle and,
Right,
yeah.
and the Journal. And all of a sudden, we have nothing but some ads rolled up
Right.
in the newspaper. We're losing our quality of life. Slowly but surely, it's all diminishing quietly, you know. I don't see that the news is now entertainment. I could watch news at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock, it's a repeat. They just run it a second time.
Well,
I'm getting entertainment, not the news.
and there was a word for it. It was called infotainment instead of news, infotainment. But the media, some have changed with the times. My wife told me there was something on getting it on her phone, It was the president of Quinnipiac talking to the editorial board of the New Haven Register. And it's coming through at 11 o'clock at night on her phone. It was on the front page of the morning paper. So the LA Times started this. They break the story online, and then they print it because many people, all they're going to get is the digital version, and they charge you for it. It's called a firewall. You can't see it unless you pay for it. But things are changing. And sometimes I look at something and I go, I guess I'm not the target audience. Yeah, if you lead with Kim Kardashian, no, just don't do it in your newscast, Other thoughts? Comments? Yes?
What's your prognosis for what's going to happen with this reporting? Do you think it'll ever come back? Do you think it'll settle down, or are we just going to...
Well, again, local reporting, I think, is basically fine. The national media, I think things have changed, and I can't see the tide going back. It's just not going to happen. There are so many sources of news. And, once upon a time, we kept hearing there's 500 channels, and none of them are any good. And then, well, guess what? There's now an infinite number of channels. It's infinite. And there's something there for everybody and entrepreneurs. That comment I made about you're all professional reporters if you want to be. The restriction is Congress shall make no law restricting the press. That means that anytime anybody disseminates news, they're the press. And I'm saying there's 300 million people. My colleagues are saying that's not a professional journalist. I says, we do not have a definition of professional journalist. You do something one time, you have to be paid for it. How about you do it one time and it gets into print or whatever? I can't get an answer from them. But when I tell them we all have the same rights, as a reporter, way back I had a press card issued by the state police, and then I started objecting. And in Philadelphia and in other places, it was happening in Connecticut, I know at the time, the media issued their own press card. I consulted a station in Kansas. I have a Kansas KSN, but it's issued by the station. We could park illegally, because sometimes you couldn't get a spot and you got a news conference. We could sometimes exceed the speed limit, which I know we did on election night when it was film. I would just close my eyes and let the photographer go. It was a courtesy, but I said, we cannot be licensed by any government medium. Now, a press credential to get in is because there's a limited number of seats, but there's no limit on the number of people who can speak up in the town square or go on the computer or do anything else. Everybody's doing it. But when you take that video shot by someone without perspective of any kind, and you're using that for your news without backing it up with your facts, no, you're not doing it right. You're taking a lazy way out. Some stories are stories only because video exists. If the video didn't happen, even they're out in L.A., the guy that said, can't we all just get along? Rodney King. If some guy hadn't had a VHS camera shooting that, never would have happened. In other words, it didn't happen. The video has changed a lot, and now add to that the immediacy. Everybody can run their own TV station right out of their cell phone. We got a lot of sources. My mother happens to get a tremendous number of things on her Facebook. And every once in a while, I don't know if you're familiar with The Onion. The Onion is a satirical thing, and they're good. But every once in a while, an Onion piece goes viral. And I say, Mom, it's from The Onion. It's a joke. It's fake news. She's 91. She's very sensitive. And I tell her I go over to Snopes and check it out too. And often it's just not true, but it's believed. That's the problem. Some people, you can't know satire unless you know the news. Go ahead.
So is that what you would recommend Snopes to decide if things are?
Well, it helps. The actual answer we give students sometimes is go to Wikipedia. Now, at the bottom of the page are the source materials, Pentagon press release and the date. Go to the source materials. Over at the Quinnipiac Library, we have a terrific librarian, Sue O'Hare is her name. She tells the students, don't go anywhere except the Arnold Bernhardt Library database. Huh? Because as soon as you put in your subject, there's all the peer-reviewed material on that subject. So it's vetted because it's peer reviewed. And they go like, wow, I don't have to get a book. You know, I can read it right here, or at least the abstract. So there are ways to get the information you want. But Snopes is a good source for starting, as is Wikipedia. There was another, go ahead.
Ken, would you say the problem is somebody could look at a frame, like the kid with the MAGA hat talking to the Indian? Can you see just one frame? Now, I did see the video that happened before that. Now, if you take a picture, like my hiking group, we take pictures, and when you're hiking, you're puffing and all that, and you have a bad look on your face. It doesn't mean you're mad at anybody. It just means that's when the person took the picture. Now, somebody could take a picture of me right here and now, and I look just the way I move my mouth. If you hit it at the right point, I'm going to look as if I'm yelling at you. Just the way it happens at that motion. And if you just see one frame, you don't see the whole thing.
We have some pictures become iconic, but they're misleading. But if I want you to feel sorry for the immigrants trying to get across our border, I'm going to take pictures of families, pregnant women, children getting dragged, and that's going to be the picture that goes with my story. You may remember a couple years ago, there was a baby over by Greece. Baby was drowned, and they carry him on the beach, and he became iconic. And you know, it doesn't matter what country or anything. It's look at what's happening to the children. And we call some of these things in the news business people angles. I can't tell the whole story, so I'm going to tell one microcosm. And almost invariably, it will be the one that pulls the emotional strings the most. The newspaper, photo, the video on the TV, the soundbite that you can, sometimes people, we call them word pictures. They write so vividly that you can see what they're talking about. These images stay with us. And then, that one where the sailor's kissing what we thought was a nurse, and then, 75 years later, you find out she wasn't a nurse, and he didn't have permission, and she didn't like it, and all this is like, but you know what? If you ran that picture today, like it just happened, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to have to check out. Okay, did you get a verbal consent? I mean, seriously. And there was no consent. He just grabbed her. And, I'm just saying that picture is iconic, and it's used to show great freedom. Yeah, but there's a limit to your freedom, especially, when it's, you know what I mean. Yes.
So, as a professor at Winnipeg.
An adjunct.
And I am too. So I know the students. I know it's a very liberal college. As most.
Did we meet recently?
Pardon me?
Did we run into each other?
We probably have run into each other, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a very liberal college. The students are very liberal in general, I find. Most colleges are. Your major schools of journalism are, liberal, have a liberal agenda. What do you tell your students? How do you make them be, more attentive to either side or both sides?
Well,
I have to tell you, I can't tell after the speech where you lean politically.
And I'll tell you something. I go out of my way. When I worked at Channel 8, and we were a small staff, one year was Emilio Daddario against Tom Mescal, and I covered them both. Both of them invited me to their homes for election night. That's before they go to their party headquarters. And both of them had said to me, "You were so fair." And they didn't both say, I thought you were for me. They just said, "You were so fair." It was hard for me that night because I really knew everything there was about them. And in the newsroom, actually at the time I was doing weather. I volunteered or do something else. But they said, "You have first choice. What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go to Daddario." And they asked me, is that because you voted for him? I said, "No, because losers are more interesting stories." And I went to the house, and it was somber. But Emilio Daddario went from here to Washington. He was the first director of some technology agency. People didn't even know the word technology. But he was really science-oriented, and not becoming governor for him was a blessing. And Meskel served one term and decided this is a lousy job and became a judge. The fact that they only knew me as a fair person. They did not see me leaning. This town, I mean, I've moderated the debates, and I just find invariably I don't know how you choose in this town sometimes. I mean, the qualifications are up there. But I can tell you, if there's a candidate that thinks I was for them, well, first of all, I don't even live in North Haven. But I always play it as a reporter, objectively. Now, there has been research in other fields that says human beings cannot be totally objective. And I used to say, it might be 51-49, but they're saying you can't be. So we had something called objectivity, and then there were studies called the myth of objectivity, that everybody is going to have a bias, but it may be subtle. And sometimes it's an adjective. If, let's say, this meeting were being held in an auditorium that seated 1,500 people, and there's only 40. Somebody who doesn't like the party that was holding that may say, there were only 40 people in a room that seats 2,000. Well, yeah, it was the only room available. And they make a point about attendance. Those of you may remember the Black Panther rally, 1970, on the Green. The initial reports were 50,000 people on the Green. And I didn't believe it. 10 years later, the New Haven Register had the photograph, an aerial photograph, analyzed. And it was 10,000. And that was 10,000, and we were packed. I mean, if you walked across the Green, you were molesting people, is the only way I can describe it. You could not, there were no paths. You had to push and shove and just to get from one side to the other. And it was interesting because I don't know that anybody challenged it. Police said 50,000, we went with 50,000. And then somebody was thinking, and they calculated how many square feet a human being occupies, and they knew the size of the Green, and then they had the analysis of the picture, and they were able to prove it was around 10,000. It only took 10 years to get there. Also, when we talk about history being relevant, a lot of my students are from New Haven, at Southern in particular, and I talked to them about Frontage Road. Why is it called Frontage Road? Well, it was the front of New Haven. It's where the slave ships came in. And then the slaves came off in shackles and walked down Orange Street to the southeast corner of the New Haven Green. And do you know what's there? And the people, water fountain. Yeah, that was the slave market. They used to walk up there, be sold. Families were split up or they were taken together. And we were the slave merchandising capital of New England. And they go, huh? And we talk about, why don't you learn that in school? And there's a lot of answers. People say it's not age appropriate, what age is. But when they look somewhere they've been and they can relate it to history, it stays. So a lot of the things I go over, how women didn't vote till 1920, how when the founding fathers said all men are created equal, they mean men. I had one student say, white men. I said, yeah, that's actually what they meant. And we go back in history, we look at what the press did and how they covered things and how Lincoln was not so keen on the press. And the people, there were so many misstatements about what he actually did or did not do. So this idea of not fake news, but inaccurate news, sometimes it takes a long time. Many people, there are courses, the Bible as journalism. Some things in the Bible are very accurate. Some things aren't because they were written in another language, translated all the way down, and then King James comes along and says, I'd like a Bible my way. And then they look and they go, oh, like you play that, what's that game, Down the Lane? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't eyewitnesses. The dates don't match up. And I say, if you're going to take it as journalism, some of it is going to turn out to be accurate and some of it isn't. And they don't want to hear that something was made up. And I'm not saying it was made up, it was believed. There are cultures out there that don't have language written, so they pass down stories. And I have a granddaughter who has a course in storytelling. That's what journalism is about. It's storytelling. And that's what, when somebody new would come into the news department, and I was the AFTRA steward, the union steward, I would say all we do here is tell stories. And that word tell was the big thing. We tell, we talk, we use a conversational language, but you got to get it right. You just have to get it right. Fancy words won't cover up a mistake. And that was, to me, that it's basic, but the pressure of time, nothing's basic anymore.
Watch town meetings or other videos on demand at nhtv.com.